He stood in the doorway holding the pieces of my passport like they were nothing more than junk mail. I remember the sound first, that dry, violent tear. Then his voice. "I'm not going with you. I'm going with Mom instead." The hotel was booked. The flights were paid for. The suitcase was packed by the door, and I had paid for every single thing. He didn't shout. He didn't look angry. That would have been easier to understand. He looked calm, cold, almost bored, like he was canceling dinner plans. I dropped to my knees and tried to gather the torn blue pieces from the floor. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even match the corners together. That was the moment I realized something terrifying. This wasn't about the trip. It was about control. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my story of betrayal, and if you've ever trusted the wrong person, hit that subscribe button because you are not alone. Here is how it happened. I was reading comments on my YouTube videos the other day, and I realized I wasn't the only one. So many women were writing about the same kind of quiet humiliation, the subtle dismissals, the "you're overreacting," the financial manipulation disguised as responsibility, the mothers-in-law who somehow became the third person in the marriage. And I kept thinking, should I finally tell them what happened to me? Because from the outside, my marriage looked stable, predictable, respectable. But inside, it felt like slowly disappearing. When I married Daniel, I believed I was marrying a partner. He was attentive in the beginning. He listened. He opened doors. He told me I was different, that I wasn't like other women, that he felt peaceful around me. I didn't notice how often his mother called during our dates. I didn't notice how he'd pause mid-conversation to text her back immediately. I didn't notice how he'd say, "Mom thinks," instead of "I think." Those things seemed small, harmless. Love makes you excuse things logic would question. The first crack showed up a year into our marriage. We were planning our anniversary trip, something simple, just a week in Italy. I'd always dreamed of seeing the Amalfi Coast. I even had a Pinterest board filled with photos of pastel houses stacked against cliffs. When I brought it up, Daniel smiled, but hesitated. "It's expensive," he said. "Maybe we should wait." I agreed. I always agreed. I was raised to be understanding. 2 weeks later, his mother mentioned over dinner that she'd never traveled to Europe. Daniel's eyes lit up, and suddenly the trip wasn't too expensive anymore. But there was a twist. "If we're going to do this," he said later that night, "you should probably cover most of it. I'm helping Mom with some expenses." Helping. I didn't know helping meant transferring thousands to her savings account every few months. I worked full-time. I had savings, so I told myself this was fine. Marriage is teamwork, right? Except I was the only one playing. I paid for the flights. I paid for the hotel. I paid for travel insurance. Daniel said he'd handle the itinerary. I thought that meant romantic dinners and scenic tours. Instead, he coordinated everything around his mother's preferences. Her hotel room was upgraded. Ours wasn't. Her flight seat was business class. We were in economy. I remember laughing awkwardly when I saw the booking confirmation. "Is this a mistake?" He looked at me like I was unreasonable. "Mom has back problems." And I don't? But I swallowed it. Because conflict with Daniel always came with a price. Silence, distance, that icy withdrawal that made me feel like I had committed a crime for simply asking a question. 3 days before departure, I found something that made my stomach drop. A separate booking confirmation. 2 tickets, different dates, same destination. Only Daniel and his mother. I stared at the screen for a full minute before my brain processed it. He wasn't planning for the three of us to travel together. He was planning to go with her first, using my money. I confronted him that night. My voice trembled, but I stayed calm. Why are there 2 tickets? He didn't deny it. We decided it would be better this way. We decided. That phrase again. What about me? He sighed like I was exhausting. You're overreacting. You can reschedule your trip later. Reschedule? I had already requested leave from work. I had already paid everything. You said this was our anniversary trip. It's just a trip, he snapped. But it wasn't. It was the first time I saw clearly that I was not his priority. I was a wallet. The argument escalated. Not loud, not dramatic, but sharp. You don't respect my mother, he accused. I said this has nothing to do with respect. It's about our marriage. He laughed. That laugh still echoes in my head. You're jealous of my mom. That's what this is. Jealous? Of his mother? I felt insulted and confused all at once. I paid for this trip, I whispered. And that's when his face changed. Something hardened. Oh, please, he said quietly. It's not like you do anything else. I felt something inside me break. I worked. I cooked. I managed our home. I handled bills. I supported him through career changes. I sat with him when he doubted himself. But in that moment, I was reduced to nothing. The next morning, I woke up to silence. His side of the bed was empty. In the living room, his suitcase was gone. And on the dining table, my passport, torn in half, with a note, problem solved. I couldn't breathe. He'd made the decision for me. He'd removed my ability to even follow them if I wanted to. I called him. He answered casually. We're heading to the airport. Don't cause a scene. We? I asked, even though I already knew. Mom's excited. He hung up. I sat on the floor for a long time, not crying, not screaming, just stunned. Because it wasn't about the passport. It was the realization that I had married someone who didn't see me as human, only useful and disposable. But what I didn't know yet was that this trip, the one I paid for, would unravel secrets far worse than betrayal. Secrets that would destroy not just a passport, but an entire illusion. And when I discovered what really happened in Italy, I wished the torn paper was the worst part. I didn't chase him to the airport. That's what the old version of me would have done, the apologetic one, the one who would have begged for explanation, for crumbs of reassurance, for dignity. Instead, I sat on the kitchen floor with my torn passport in my lap and let something unfamiliar rise inside me. Clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't confused. I wasn't wondering if I was too sensitive. I wasn't asking myself how to fix it. I was asking something else entirely. Why did I allow this? The messages started coming in around noon. Photos. Daniel and his mother at the airport lounge. Her smiling into the camera. Him holding 2 glasses of champagne. The caption read, "Much needed getaway with the most important woman in my life, Heart." Most important. My hands didn't even shake this time. I zoomed into the background of one photo. Business class lounge. Of course, the same business class ticket I had questioned. He didn't reply to my texts anymore, but he was posting, performing, crafting a narrative where I didn't exist. And that's when I made a decision that would change everything. I called the airline. I had the booking numbers. I had the receipts. My card had paid for every charge. The representative was polite. Yes, ma'am, I see the reservation. Yes, ma'am, the tickets are non-refundable. I expected that, but then she said something I wasn't prepared for. However, I do see an additional return booking under your husband's name scheduled earlier than the original return date. Earlier? That can't be right, I whispered. They are scheduled to return 4 days before the hotel stay ends. 4 days? Why would they leave early? Unless the original return date wasn't for them, it was for me. I felt something cold slide down my spine. I hung up and immediately opened the hotel reservation confirmation again. 3 guests listed. 3, but I had only ever seen 2 flight tickets for that later return date, meaning there was someone else, someone who wasn't his mother. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I called the hotel in Italy. My voice was steady, professional. Hi, I just wanted to confirm the number of guests on reservation number 4472. One moment, Senora. Pause. Yes, I see 3 guests listed, a double room and an additional adult guest. Additional adult guest. Can you tell me the name of the 3rd guest? I'm sorry, for privacy reasons. I'm the one who paid, I interrupted softly. Another pause. I can confirm the 3rd guest shares the same last name as your husband. My world tilted. His last name, not his mother's. His last name. Daniel didn't have a sister. He didn't have a female cousin with his exact last name. There was only one possibility, and the moment it hit me, I couldn't unsee it. He wasn't going with his mother. He was going with his mother and someone else, someone who had taken my place. I didn't call him. I didn't accuse him. Instead, I did something smarter. I checked our joint bank account. There were transfers I had never noticed, small ones, $300 here, $500 there, always labeled as family support, but the recipient wasn't his mother. It was a woman's name I didn't recognize. The transfers went back 8 months. 8 months, long before this trip, long before the torn passport. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty, it was calculated. By evening, I was no longer shocked. I was strategic. I gathered every receipt, every screenshot, every transaction. Then I logged into our shared cloud account. Daniel wasn't good with technology. He saved everything automatically. And there it was, a folder, hidden but not hidden enough, titled simply Summer. Inside were photos, not of Italy, of her. Selfies sent from a mirror, messages captured in screenshots, hotel confirmations, and one image that made my chest cave in. A picture of her wearing my necklace, the one Daniel told me he had misplaced. She was smiling into the camera, and his message below it read, "Soon, just a few more weeks." I don't know how long I sat there staring at that screen. Grief is strange. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it goes silent. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was layered. He used my money to fund his affair. He used his mother as a shield, and he destroyed my passport so I couldn't interrupt the fantasy. That wasn't impulsive. That was premeditated. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. Landed safely. That was it. No apology, no explanation, just a status update. I stared at his contact name on my screen. For years it had been saved with a heart emoji. I deleted it, replaced it with just his full name, Daniel Whitmore. Cold, formal, distant. It felt appropriate. The next morning I did something he never expected. I went to a lawyer. I didn't cry in the office. I didn't rant. I presented facts, financial manipulation, destruction of legal documents, infidelity evidence. The lawyer's eyebrows lifted slightly when I showed him the torn passport pieces in a plastic bag. "That's destruction of government property," he said calmly, "and potentially coercive control. Coercive control. There was a name for what I'd been experiencing, and suddenly I didn't feel crazy. I felt validated. But the real twist came 3 days later. I received a message, not from Daniel, from her, the woman. Her profile picture matched the selfies in the folder. She didn't know I knew. Her message was short. "Hi, I think we need to talk." My heart didn't race this time. It steadied because I already knew something she didn't. She thought she was winning. She thought she was replacing me. She had no idea she was stepping into a collapsing house of lies. I typed back one word, "Okay." And when she told me the truth about what Daniel had promised her, about the money, about the divorce papers he claimed were already filed, about the story he told her about me being unstable and financially dependent, that's when the real game began, because she wasn't the villain, she was another pawn. And if Daniel thought he could manipulate 2 women without consequences, he was about to learn something unforgettable. But what he didn't know was that his mother wasn't as innocent as she pretended to be, and what I uncovered next would prove this wasn't just betrayal, it was a family operation, and I was done being their silent sponsor. By the 4th day, I had pieced together a clearer picture of what I was really up against. Daniel's perfect getaway with Mom wasn't just an escape. It was a carefully constructed web. Every detail, every transaction, every carefully worded lie pointed to one thing: control. He didn't just want to hurt me, he wanted to erase me. I realized I couldn't fight him alone, not against the calculated combination of his charm, his mother's subtle influence, and the other woman's unwitting participation. I needed allies. I reached out to my oldest friend, Sarah. She arrived at my apartment within the hour, and the first thing she said when she saw me sprawled across the sofa, surrounded by torn passport pieces, receipts, and screenshots, was, "Holy hell, Mariam, this is bigger than I thought." I didn't have the energy to nod. I just handed her the folder labeled Summer. She skimmed through it, eyes widening with each photo and message. This is insane. He's been feeding lies to both of you. This is manipulation at a professional level," she said. I felt a small flicker of vindication. Someone saw it for what it was, not a trivial betrayal, not a mid-life mistake, manipulation. The next step was confronting his mother. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Daniel's mother, Margaret, had always been the quiet puppeteer in the background. She never raised her voice, she never overtly interfered, but the way she injected herself into every decision, every holiday, every important choice had been suffocating for years. I called her. Her voice on the phone was calm, polished, a warm tone masking steel underneath. "Mariam, darling, what's wrong?" I took a deep breath. "You know about the trip," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You know what Daniel did with my money, my passport, and the other woman." There was silence on the line. Then a small, deliberate laugh. "Oh, Mariam, I think you're misunderstanding. I've always been looking out for him, for both of you, really." I didn't flinch. "Looking out for him? You're complicit. Every step. You've been facilitating this control for months, I know." Another pause. "I see," she said finally. "Well, I suppose we'll have to have a conversation when he returns." Her words chilled me. She didn't deny it. She didn't try to soften it. She just confirmed, indirectly, that Daniel wasn't acting alone. I spent the next few days mapping every interaction, every transaction, every subtle act of control. I wanted proof. I wanted clarity. And then I discovered something worse. Daniel had made arrangements for me to be left in Italy alone at the hotel while he and the other woman enjoyed the coast. A sick, twisted part of me had to pause and process it. He had planned for me to travel, paid by me, but stranded, isolated, powerless. I could have called it quits. I could have crumpled under the weight of humiliation. But I didn't. Instead, I decided to flip the script. Step 1, the decoy plan. I booked a flight to Italy under my own name, using my savings, not touching the joint account. I made it look like I was following through with the original plan, but this time I would be armed with the truth, with leverage, and with an exit strategy. Step 2, communication. I reached out to Clara. Let's call her Clara. Clara was confused when I texted, defensive even. "Who is this?" she asked. I didn't start with accusations. I started with clarity. "Clara, I'm Mariam. I'm Daniel's wife. I know everything. The transfers, the hotel, the tickets. I want to be clear. I'm not your enemy. He is." There was silence for a while, then a long, hesitant message. I didn't know. I thought he was divorced. He said you agreed to this." Her panic was genuine, and that was my opening. By the time I landed in Italy, I had an ally in Clara. She met me in a quiet cafe near the hotel. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and guilt. "Mariam, I didn't want this," she said. "I know," I replied softly, "but we have to be smart. He's been manipulating both of us, and now we need to stop him." We devised a plan to gather proof while keeping ourselves safe. Photos, hotel receipts, messages, bank transfers, everything would be documented. And the most crucial part, we needed witnesses. The day Daniel and his mother returned to the hotel was the day everything escalated. I saw him first, standing by the lobby entrance, looking smug, carrying his suitcase and the confident smile of someone who thought he was untouchable. Clara and I were waiting discreetly in the cafe across the street. When he spotted us, his face changed. That calm, controlled mask slipped. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, voice low. "Just enjoying the trip," I said, smiling sweetly. "Alone, like you intended for me." The sharp edge in his jaw told me I had gotten under his skin. And that's when Margaret appeared. She walked past me, not acknowledging my presence, but I caught the cold gleam in her eyes, the unspoken message, "This isn't over." We stayed put, documenting every interaction, every lie. By the end of the afternoon, we had amassed enough evidence to expose not just the affair, but the entire network of deceit. Messages to Clara, bank transfers, airline bookings, hotel records, even emails Margaret had sent, all under the guise of helping organize the trip. This was bigger than betrayal. This was manipulation on a systematic, almost professional level. That night, Daniel sent a message to Clara. "Everything will be fine. She won't find out." I read it aloud to her. She looked at me, eyes wide. She thinks she's protecting me, but she's just reinforcing his lies. We laughed, a little bitter, a little relieved. For the first time, I felt like we were in control, and I realized something critical. Betrayal loses its power when you see it clearly, when you name it, when you refuse to be a silent participant. But even as we celebrated this small victory, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Confrontation, justice, reclaiming my life from the man who had systematically tried to erase me. Because Daniel and Margaret weren't going to step down quietly. They were invested emotionally, financially, strategically, and now they were going to fight back. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't afraid anymore. And the next time we crossed paths, They would see a version of me that had been silent for too long. The morning after our covert documentation mission, I woke with a strange sense of purpose. I had spent years trying to appease Daniel, smoothing over conflicts, negotiating silent compromises, always careful not to upset the balance, always careful not to make him mad. But that life was over. Now, armed with evidence, clarity, and an unlikely ally in Clara, I was ready to step into a new version of myself, one who didn't flinch in the face of betrayal. I called my lawyer first thing. "Miriam," he said, once I explained the situation, "this is significant. He's crossed legal boundaries multiple times, and now, with your evidence, we can hold him accountable. But you have to be strategic, move carefully." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I'm ready," I said. It felt good to say it out loud, to claim my own power. Step 1, reclaim the narrative. Daniel had spent months building a story in which I was unstable, jealous, and financially irresponsible. Now it was time to flip it. I wrote an email to Clara instructing her to forward all messages, receipts, and screenshots to me. Every detail mattered, every timestamp, every tiny piece of proof. She responded immediately with a flurry of messages, apologies, and clarifications. "Miriam, I had no idea," she wrote. "I really didn't. I feel awful." "I know, but now we have to focus on what to do next. We need to make sure this ends on our terms, not his." Step 2, expose the patterns. I had long suspected that his mother, Margaret, was more than just a passive enabler. Now I had proof. Emails between Daniel and Margaret, subtle instructions about financial transfers, notes about keeping Miriam busy, and even suggestions about the timing of the trip to Italy. Margaret wasn't innocent. She wasn't just protective or overbearing. She was actively participating in the control and manipulation. I felt a wave of anger, but also clarity. Understanding the full scope made it easier to act. Step 3, plan the confrontation. I knew that walking into the hotel lobby and yelling accusations would achieve nothing. Daniel and Margaret thrived on theatrics. They were masters at deflection, at gaslighting, at turning a confrontation into a twisted display of sympathy for themselves. No, this had to be precise, documented, public, legal, strategic. I called the hotel manager. "Hello, this is Miriam Whitmore. I'm currently off-site but have some concerns about recent bookings and potential disputes. I need your cooperation to ensure everything is documented accurately." The manager was cooperative, almost alarmingly so. "Of course, ma'am, whatever you need." I hung up, feeling a small thrill. The pieces were falling into place. By evening, Clara and I had a plan. Collect final evidence during Daniel and Margaret's departure from the hotel, ensure all digital and physical proof was safely backed up, schedule a formal meeting with my lawyer once we returned home. We rehearsed the narrative, clear, concise, unemotional. The facts, not the hysteria. Because facts have power. Emotions can be manipulated. Facts can't. The next morning, we followed them to the airport. Daniel walked with his usual air of superiority. Clara whispered, "He looks nervous." I smiled, but carefully, never openly, never gave him the satisfaction of seeing my fear or my knowledge. Margaret walked slightly ahead, handbag swinging, her eyes scanning the crowd, but there was a subtle tension in her posture. I had seen it before. The calculation, the realization that their control was slipping. And then it happened. At the security, Daniel's phone buzzed. A message. He glanced at it, then his face changed. "Miriam," he hissed under his breath, a tone I had never heard before, panicked, frantic. I didn't answer. I just kept my distance, watching carefully. Clara nudged me. "He knows." she whispered. He didn't know what I knew, but he knew someone knew. And that panic, that flicker of vulnerability in a man who had always projected calm dominance, it was satisfying. By the time they reached the lounge, I had already discreetly sent copies of the evidence to my lawyer, including timestamps and geolocations. Every step, every lie, every manipulation was now in professional hands. Daniel was texting frantically now, trying to reach Clara, trying to reach me, trying to control something, but nothing worked. Margaret shot me a glance, cold, warning, but too late. I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. On the flight back home, I reviewed everything. Daniel's deception spanned months: the affair, the misappropriation of funds, the manipulation of travel plans, the destruction of my passport, and his mother's quiet complicity. But I had proof, clear, undeniable proof. And I realized something. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my autonomy, my life. The day after we returned, my lawyer filed an initial complaint: civil action, financial restitution, and documentation of coercive control. It felt surreal. I wasn't used to taking such decisive steps. For years, I had been careful, accommodating, apologetic, but that version of me no longer existed. I was no longer afraid of confrontation. I was afraid of nothing. Even Daniel's allies began to crack. Friends who had once sided silently with him now reached out cautiously, realizing that the narrative he had spun about me being unstable was unraveling. Clara and I watched this unfold like a storm we had orchestrated. And through it all, I discovered a truth. Betrayal loses its power when you see it clearly, expose it publicly, and refuse to accept silence. The fear he instilled for years? Gone. The control? Broken. And the next time we met, it wouldn't be as the submissive, accommodating wife. It would be as someone who had learned to fight. But even with all the evidence, all the preparation, I knew one thing: confrontation wouldn't end neatly. Daniel would fight. Margaret would defend him. The system of manipulation they had built would resist, retaliate, and attempt to shift blame. I had no illusions. This battle was only beginning. But I had the truth, and in the end, truth has a way of cutting through deception, no matter how deeply buried. And as I prepared for the final showdown, I realized something I hadn't felt in years: power. The kind that comes from knowing you will no longer be a pawn. The kind that comes from standing tall after being torn down. The kind that comes from being fully awake to the people who tried to erase you. The morning of the confrontation, I woke early. The sunlight spilling across the bedroom felt almost symbolic, a quiet promise that today nothing would stay hidden. I went through my checklist one last time, all evidence backed up, messages cataloged, bank transfers logged, receipts organized, hotel confirmations ready, every single detail documented. Clara was already at my apartment when I arrived. Her eyes were serious but resolute. She'd gone from fear and confusion to determination in the past few days. I realized we were now partners in this battle, bonded not by friendship, but by the shared experience of being manipulated. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. I nodded. I've never been more ready. We left for the lawyer's office, our steps synchronized, silent, purposeful. The city streets felt almost empty compared to the storm brewing inside my mind. Every honk, every passerby, every fluttering flag outside the cafe reminded me that life goes on, even as betrayal unfolds. At the office, we met with my lawyer, and I walked him through the entire timeline. I started from the torn passport, through the Italy trip, through Clara's involvement, Daniel's premeditated manipulation, Margaret's complicity, and finally the evidence we had gathered. He listened quietly, occasionally jotting notes. When I finished, he leaned back and said, Mariam, this is more than sufficient to move forward. The coercive control, the financial manipulation, the infidelity, they're all documented. But you need to understand the emotional aspect is secondary in court. Focus on facts, timelines, and proof. I nodded. I understood, but it was hard to separate the emotional weight from the cold, hard facts. The humiliation, the anger, the feeling of being used. It was all still raw, pulsing under my skin like an open wound. But now I had a strategy, and strategy changes everything. We prepared a letter, a formal demand for restitution and acknowledgement of the damage caused. Clara and I signed it together. It was calm, factual, almost clinical, but the words beneath that professionalism carried years of hurt, manipulation, and betrayal. We sent it to Daniel and Margaret via certified mail. The confirmation receipts felt like victory in themselves. They couldn't deny receipt. They couldn't claim ignorance. Every lie, every excuse, every attempt at manipulation would now have to face the light. The waiting period was excruciating. Every email ping, every phone vibration sent a jolt through my chest. Would they respond? Would they try to twist the story, shift blame? When the first reply came, it wasn't from Daniel. It was from Margaret. Her tone was formal, calculated. She offered an apology, but it was hollow, vague, and designed to placate without admitting guilt. Daniel's response followed hours later. He claimed misunderstanding. He claimed I was overreacting. He claimed financial errors were accidental, but he did not deny the affair, and he did not attempt to reconcile. The truth was out, and now the real power shifted to me. In the weeks that followed, we continued to gather proof, corroborate evidence, and prepare for the legal proceedings. Daniel tried to regain control. He sent messages, attempted calls, even showed up at my apartment once, but Clara and I were ready. The lawyer's presence, the documentation, and our unwavering resolve made it clear that no intimidation would work. I began to notice a shift in myself. Where I had once been anxious, apologetic, hesitant, I was now assertive. Where I had once sought approval, I now sought justice. Where I had once questioned my own perception, I now trusted my instincts, my clarity, my understanding of what truly happened. This was not just about a trip anymore. This was about reclaiming my life. One evening, Clara and I sat together, reviewing messages that Daniel had sent her during his attempts to cover his tracks. "I can't believe he thought this would work," Clara said, shaking her head. "He underestimated both of us," I said, "and he underestimated me. That's always the mistake men like him make. They think women are silent, compliant, and easy to erase. But when you stop being invisible, when you reclaim your voice, that's when the game changes." We laughed softly, a little bitter, a little triumphant, and I realized I wasn't just reclaiming power over Daniel, I was reclaiming myself. The day of the legal meeting finally arrived. I walked into the conference room, documents in hand, clarity in my mind, fire in my chest. Daniel and Margaret were there, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and thinly veiled anger. My lawyer outlined the evidence, each bank transfer, each booking, each destroyed document, each premeditated act of control. Daniel tried to interrupt, Margaret tried to deflect, but the proof was undeniable. Every piece had been meticulously documented, every act had been logged, every lie had been caught in writing, time-stamped, and corroborated. By the end of the meeting, it was clear they had lost. The aftermath was surreal. Daniel avoided me, his arrogance replaced by a cold wariness. Margaret retreated, her usual influence nullified by the fact that her complicity had been exposed. Clara and I, once pawns in Daniel's manipulative game, now emerged as witnesses and survivors. I felt a strange sense of liberation. It wasn't perfect. There was still emotional scars, still moments of anger and disbelief, but the power imbalance had shifted. I had stepped out of the role he had assigned me, the submissive, compliant wife. I had reclaimed my autonomy, my dignity, and my life. And the most important lesson lingered. Betrayal is devastating, but it is only as powerful as the silence that surrounds it. Speak, act, document, protect yourself, reclaim what is yours. That night, I packed my own bag. My passport was replaced, my savings intact, my plans back in my hands. Italy was no longer a symbol of betrayal. It was a reminder of my strength. Clara and I toasted quietly in my apartment, wine glasses clinking softly. To clarity, she said. To power, I added. And to never letting anyone erase us again, she concluded. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free. But freedom, I quickly realized, comes with responsibility. Daniel and Margaret would not forgive, they would not forget, and I would have to navigate life knowing what I had endured and survived. Yet even as I faced the uncertainty, I felt a strange excitement because survival, empowerment, and truth are powerful allies. And the journey of reclaiming your life after betrayal is one of the most intense awakenings a person can experience. The weeks after the confrontation were quieter, but not peaceful. Quiet doesn't mean safe. It just means the storm has moved from obvious chaos to the tense anticipation of retaliation. Daniel didn't speak to me directly anymore. Margaret sent occasional veiled messages through family friends, attempting to manipulate, guilt, or provoke. But I didn't respond. I refused. Silence became my weapon. Clara and I spent hours reviewing every step, every interaction, ensuring that no thread of manipulation remained unchecked. Emails, receipts, messages, photos, all meticulously logged. We even recorded our conversations when Daniel tried to reach us, ensuring that any future disputes would be backed by irrefutable evidence. I began noticing subtle things about myself I hadn't seen in years. The tension in my shoulders eased. My confidence grew. The fear that had clung to me like a shadow for years began to fade. I realized that living under constant manipulation had trained me to doubt myself, second-guess every thought, and apologize for existing. Now, I existed unapologetically. I met with a therapist for the first time in years. I had dismissed therapy before, believing I could handle it. But she helped me process the layers of betrayal, the calculated manipulation, the gaslighting, the destruction of my passport, the financial exploitation. Every tear I shed in those sessions was part of reclaiming myself. Each acknowledgement of pain was a brick in the foundation of my new life. Daniel, predictably, didn't stay silent forever. He began spreading rumors through mutual acquaintances, painting a narrative in which I was overreacting, unstable, and jealous. He attempted to undermine my credibility, thinking that the web of lies he spun would protect him. But by now, I had developed a different perspective. I wasn't defensive, I wasn't anxious, I documented everything. If someone asked for my side, I presented the facts. No emotion, no begging, just clarity. And people began to listen. One afternoon, I received an unexpected message from a distant relative of Daniel's mother. "Mariam," it read, "I've seen the situation unfold. Your strength is remarkable. Please don't let them manipulate or intimidate you." Her words felt surreal, recognition from someone who had been outside the storm, someone who could see it for what it was. And in that moment, I realized something essential. Betrayal loses its power not just when you act, but when others validate your experience, when the truth is visible, undeniable, and understood. Clara and I continued our plan to rebuild our lives. We traveled to Italy, not for Daniel or his manipulations, but for ourselves. The Amalfi Coast, which had once symbolized deceit and loss, now represented resilience and freedom. We stayed in a small villa far from the hotels Daniel had booked. The sunlight on the cliffs, the smell of the sea, the laughter we shared over dinners in tiny trattorias, everything became a reclamation of joy. And yet there was an undercurrent of tension. We knew Daniel and Margaret were still plotting. They would not disappear quietly. It happened 2 weeks into our trip. An email arrived. Subject line, "We need to discuss settlement." It was from Daniel's lawyer. The tone was cautious, almost fearful. For the first time, they were on the defensive. I read the email aloud to Clara. "They're offering to settle," I said, feeling a surge of vindication. "They know the evidence is irrefutable." Clara laughed softly. "It's about time." I replied formally, outlining the terms we would accept: financial restitution, written acknowledgement of coercion and manipulation, assurance of no further contact unless legally mandated, clear, concise, unwavering. And just like that, the power balance shifted definitively. Back home, the settlement was finalized. Daniel had lost. Margaret had lost. Their attempts at control, manipulation, and deceit had crumbled under the weight of documented truth. I received the financial restitution I had long deserved, but more importantly, I reclaimed my autonomy, my dignity, my voice. Clara and I celebrated quietly, not with fanfare or dramatic gestures, but with the simple, profound knowledge that we had survived and we had won. Yet even amidst the victory, there were lingering emotions I hadn't anticipated. Betrayal leaves scars. Even after restitution, after validation, after justice, there are moments when anger arises unbidden, when sadness creeps in, when you catch yourself replaying the manipulation in your mind. I had to learn to navigate those moments, to breathe through them, to ground myself in the reality that I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever. Through it all, I discovered the most important lesson. Betrayal is not an endpoint. It is a catalyst, a force that reveals character, strength, and priorities. It exposes hidden patterns. It teaches you the depth of your own resilience. And most importantly, it forces you to confront the truth of who you are and who you refuse to be. Months passed. Life began to normalize. The shadows of Daniel and Margaret receded. Clara and I forged a stronger friendship, bonded by the shared experience and the knowledge that we had protected ourselves and each other. I returned to my daily life with a new perspective. Every financial decision, every personal boundary, every relationship was now filtered through a lens of clarity and self-respect. I no longer doubted my instincts. I no longer excused manipulation. I no longer tolerated deceit. And the most profound realization hit me one quiet evening sitting on my balcony overlooking the city lights. I had survived someone who had tried to erase me. I had survived betrayal that felt insurmountable, and in surviving, I had found a version of myself stronger than I had ever known. But Daniel and Margaret weren't gone from my life entirely. There were still legal matters to monitor, there were still people to manage who had been manipulated by them, and there was still the subtle fear that someone like Daniel, someone skilled at deceit, might reemerge. Yet even with that awareness, I was unshaken. Because surviving betrayal isn't about ensuring the enemy disappears. It's about ensuring you are no longer vulnerable. It's about reclaiming your life with clarity, purpose, and power. And that is exactly what I had done. The weeks after the settlement were supposed to be quiet. I told myself I had won, that Daniel and Margaret were neutralized, that the storm had passed. But storms have a way of returning when you least expect them. It started with subtle signs, a message to Clara, a vague threat disguised as casual concern, then an email to me, unsigned but unmistakably Daniel's handwriting in tone. "Be careful what you share. Some people are watching." The first time I read it, my stomach dropped. Old fear flickered like a candle in the wind, but I refused to panic. I refused to give him the reaction he wanted. I reminded myself, the power is in preparation, clarity, and calm. Still, I could feel it. This was not over. Not yet. A week later, I received a package at my door. No return address. Inside, carefully wrapped in plain brown paper, was my torn passport. The pieces were carefully taped together. On top, a single note in precise, familiar handwriting: "You're getting ahead of yourself. Enjoy your little victory while it lasts." My hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury. Clara arrived minutes later, and when she saw the package, her face paled. I opened it calmly, spreading the torn fragments on the table. We didn't speak for a moment, letting the weight of what it meant settle. "He's testing you," Clara whispered. "No," I said, my voice low and controlled. "He's overreaching, and overreaching is dangerous for him." That night, I formulated a plan, not to react emotionally, not to be intimidated, but to strike decisively, to take control of the narrative fully, legally, and publicly if needed. I began by reviewing every interaction, every threat, every subtle manipulation, and noting where he had crossed the line legally. Sending passive threats, tampering with government-issued documents, and attempts to intimidate witnesses were all criminal acts. I documented everything: time-stamped photos, screenshots of emails, detailed notes of phone calls. This time, I wasn't just prepared, I was armored. Then came the next escalation. Daniel sent a direct message to Clara, aggressive and desperate. "Tell her to stop, or I swear this will get messy. She doesn't know what she's dealing with." Clara called me immediately, panic evident. "Mariam, he's serious," she said. I took a deep breath. "Good," I replied. "Then let's make sure everything is documented." We knew Daniel's next moves would be reckless. That recklessness would be our advantage. A few days later, we received another tip, this time from a hotel manager in a different city. Daniel had booked a private suite under a fake name, apparently planning to confront Clara or me when he thought we were unprotected. My heart raced, but not with fear, with anticipation. "Clara," I said, "he's coming to force a confrontation. That's exactly what we want, but we're not alone this time." I called my lawyer and law enforcement contacts. Within hours, we had set up surveillance, legal cover, and witness protection. Daniel's audacity would be his downfall. The confrontation began late at night. Clara and I were in the city apartment, lights dimmed, cameras discreetly positioned, recording every angle. I could hear a subtle shuffle outside, Daniel probably checking if anyone was home. Then came the knock. "Mariam," his voice hissed from the door, "open up, now." I remained seated, calm, eyes on the recording camera. "Go away, Daniel. This is over. You need to leave. Law enforcement is aware of your actions." He laughed, sharp, manic, unhinged. "You think you've won? You've just made me angry. You're going to regret this, both of you." Clara held my hand tightly. "We're ready," she whispered. And then it happened. He tried to push the door open. I stepped forward calmly. "This is your last warning. One more step and it's criminal trespassing." He froze. For a moment, I saw the man who had always been in control, the confident, calculating husband, falter. And then Margaret appeared at the doorframe, trying to intervene. "Mariam, stop this. He's just trying to—" "Shh," I said firmly, holding up my hand. "You've had your chance to manipulate, threaten, and deceive. This ends now." Daniel's mask slipped entirely. Rage replaced calculation. He lunged, but the security cameras and recording devices captured everything. Every aggressive move, every attempt at intimidation, every angry word. By the time law enforcement arrived, Daniel and Margaret were exposed completely. There was no story to twist, no evidence to hide behind. Everything had been documented meticulously. I watched as Daniel was escorted out, his face pale, defeated, and unmasked for everyone to see. Margaret followed, silent, realizing for the first time that her influence and manipulation had crumbled entirely. Clara and I stood together, shoulders touching, and finally allowed ourselves to exhale. The tension, the fear, the manipulation, all of it was over. In the aftermath, I realized something profound. Betrayal escalates when the betrayer senses control. The higher they build their deception, the more desperate their fall. Daniel had underestimated two things: our clarity and our courage. We had turned his own manipulations into evidence, his threats into documentation, his lies into public truth. And in that, I found a satisfaction that was quiet yet absolute. The months following were about rebuilding. Financial restitution was finalized. Legal measures ensured no further contact. Daniel and Margaret were neutralized, not just socially but legally. I returned to daily life with a renewed sense of self. Every interaction, every boundary, every personal choice was now informed by experience, vigilance, and clarity. I realized the most important truth: power doesn't come from wealth, charm, or manipulation. It comes from knowing the truth, standing firm, and refusing to be erased. And as I stood on my balcony one evening, the city lights shimmering below, I reflected on the journey. Betrayal had been devastating, but surviving it, seeing it clearly, confronting it strategically, and reclaiming autonomy had transformed me. I was no longer a victim. I was a strategist, a survivor, a woman who had faced calculated manipulation and emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakable. The final confrontation had proven one thing: betrayal loses its power only when you stop running, stop hiding, and stop letting fear dictate your actions. And I had done exactly that.
The days after the final confrontation felt surreal. There was an almost tangible silence in my life, the kind that comes after a storm has passed, that the air still holds the tension of what has occurred. I walked through my apartment, and for the first time in years, every corner felt like mine. No one had orchestrated it. No one had planted fear here. This was the life I had reclaimed. I spent hours reflecting on what had happened, not just the betrayal itself, but the patterns that had allowed it to unfold. Daniel had thrived on subtlety, quiet manipulation, controlling finances, dictating plans, isolating me from people who might have warned me. Margaret had been the silent partner, embedding herself into every decision, pretending to protect while actually orchestrating the harm. And I, for years, had trusted blindly, believing love and loyalty could shield me from deceit. The realization was bitter but empowering. Betrayal is not just about the other person, it's about what it teaches you. And I had learned in brutal detail the art of vigilance, of documentation, and of self-respect. Clara and I continued to rebuild our lives together, our bond now unbreakable. The friendship that had been tested by crisis had transformed into a partnership of mutual protection and empowerment. We took a trip, not out of revenge or confrontation, but purely for ourselves, a quiet getaway where laughter replaced fear, where decisions were made freely, without manipulation, without compromise of our dignity. We stayed in a small villa near the Amalfi Coast, savoring the irony. This had once been the site of Daniel's manipulations, the location he thought would trap and humiliate me. Now it was a monument to freedom. Every sunset, every ocean breeze, every quiet morning on the balcony reminded me that autonomy and joy are not given, they are reclaimed. When I returned home, I began to reorganize my life on a larger scale. Financially, I reasserted control over everything that had been mismanaged or misappropriated. Every joint account, every credit line, every shared property was audited, reclaimed, and secured. I contacted financial advisors I could trust, people who understood the stakes and would protect me rather than exploit me. Emotionally, I sought therapy consistently. I processed the anger, the humiliation, and the lingering fear. I confronted the grief over the years I had lost under manipulation. And I realized that healing was not linear, it was deliberate. Every session, every conversation, every moment of reflection became an act of reclaiming power. The legal aftermath continued for months. Daniel and Margaret's attempts to minimize, justify, or intimidate were systematically dismantled. Each court session, each lawyer meeting, each formal communication reinforced a lesson I had learned painfully. Control is an illusion when you have facts, clarity, and unwavering resolve. Daniel attempted social manipulation through mutual friends, spreading distorted narratives about my character. But by this point, I no longer feared reputation as he had controlled it. I countered with calm, factual clarity. No anger, no dramatics, just truth. And slowly, the truth began to win. Friends, acquaintances, and even distant relatives started seeing the situation for what it was. In this period, I discovered the final, profound truth. Betrayal can reveal not only the flaws of others, but also the strengths within yourself. I had discovered courage I didn't know existed, the ability to remain calm under threat, the precision to gather evidence, anticipate manipulation, and act strategically. I had learned how to reclaim my narrative and ensure that no one, not even someone as meticulous and controlling as Daniel, could overwrite my reality. This awareness was both humbling and exhilarating. I had been through the fire, and now I emerged stronger, more self-aware, and more prepared for life than ever before. Eventually, the emotional dust settled. I found myself thinking less about revenge or justice and more about growth. The anger, though never entirely gone, became manageable, a reminder of what I had endured rather than a burden I carried daily. I began volunteering for local women's support groups, sharing my experience to help others recognize manipulation and control in relationships. Every story I shared, every listener who nodded in recognition, reminded me that betrayal, while intensely personal, is also universal. I also revisited the concept of trust. For years, I had given it freely, believing in people's innate goodness. Betrayal had shaken that belief, but not destroyed it. I learned to trust with awareness, to protect my boundaries fiercely, and to value actions over words. Trust became not a blind gift, but a carefully assessed choice, a gift given only to those who have proven themselves worthy. And then, finally, there was closure. Not through confrontation or revenge, but through understanding. I understood that Daniel's manipulation said more about him than me, that Margaret's silent complicity revealed her own fears and insecurities, not my inadequacy, that Clara's fear and loyalty reflected the potential for goodness even amid chaos. I understood that betrayal is a crucible. It burns, but it also purifies. It strips away illusions, exposing both danger and strength. And when navigated with awareness, it can lead to an unparalleled clarity of self. Sitting quietly on my balcony one evening overlooking the city lights, I reflected on everything: the torn passport, the lost money, the manipulation, the confrontation, the legal battles, and the eventual resolution. I realized something crucial. Betrayal, no matter how deep, is only devastating if you let it define you. Power is reclaimed not by avoiding pain, but by facing it head-on, documenting it, and refusing to let fear dictate your actions. I survived, I fought, I reclaimed my dignity, my autonomy, and my life. And I knew with absolute certainty that nothing and no one could take that away from me again. The moral of my story is simple. Betrayal is painful, but it is also illuminating. It exposes weakness in others, yes, but it also exposes strengths within yourself. Survival requires awareness, strategy, and courage. Revenge is unnecessary when truth is undeniable. Power lies not in retaliation, but in clarity, action, and self-respect. As I closed the chapter on Daniel and Margaret, I felt an unshakable sense of freedom. I had been tested, deceived, and humiliated, but I had emerged whole, stronger, wiser, and fully in control of my life.
For anyone listening, watching, or reading this, betrayal may feel like the end, but it is often the beginning of profound awakening. And the greatest victory is not punishment of the betrayer, it is reclaiming your life, your voice, and your peace. This is my story, a story of deception, manipulation, betrayal, and ultimately survival. I am no longer a victim of their control. I am a witness to the power of clarity, courage, and self-respect. And I will never allow anyone to erase me again. The journey was brutal, emotional, and unrelenting, but it taught me something invaluable: the strength to endure, the wisdom to act, and the courage to reclaim my life is always within you. And with that, my chapter with Daniel and Margaret closes, not with vengeance, but with liberation, clarity, and moral closure.